dear students, to the massive open online course on international economics. In today's module, we are going to talk about the international monetary system. In this module, we would like to explore the meaning of the international monetary system. We would like to explain the characteristics of a good international monetary system. And on top of that, we would chart out the different types of international monetary system through the ages. Now, coming to the definition of the international monetary system, it basically comprises of a set of official arrangements that regulate the key dimensions of the balance of payments. The objective of the international monetary system is to contribute to the stable and high global growth while fostering price and financial stability. It basically consists of four elements: the exchange arrangements and exchange rates, the international payments and transfers relating to current international transactions, international capital movements, and international reserves. The essential purpose of the international monetary system is to facilitate the exchange of goods, services, and capital amongst different countries. In 2007, the IMF sought to broaden the scope of the surveillance from the narrow scope or focus on exchange rates to the concept of external stability. The financial relations amongst nations may be organized in different ways, and not surprisingly, the international monetary system has historically evolved in different ways and has assumed different forms. Now, coming to the characteristics of a good international monetary system. The international monetary system should be such that it helps in the maximization of the total world output, and also it should aim at the achievement of equitable distribution of welfare gains among the nations. The maximization of the world output presupposes free trade in goods, services, and factors of production. Ensuring this is clearly not easy. Nations do have incentives to cooperate amongst themselves in order to maximize the world output. But this cooperation may not be forthcoming if there are disagreements over the distribution of gains from free trade. If each nation or groups of nations tries to get a bigger slice of the pie than justified by some reasonable type of arrangements or criteria previously decided, then it becomes the bone of contention, and international cooperation may break down in this process. The optional tariff is a case in point. When this sets off competitive retaliation amongst the trading nations, in the end, all may be worse off. Therefore, a good international monetary system should aim at fostering cooperation amongst the trading nations and at minimizing their potential policy conflicts within each nation. Obviously, there would be no rivalries or conflicts over gains from international trades if nations do not engage in trade at all. In contrast, a complete anarchy will prevail if trading nations could do whatever they liked. Both these extremes are undesirable and absurd. And this points to the need for a good international monetary system that would allow an orderly evolution and growth of world trade and ultimately, at the end of the day, the welfare of the whole world. Now, coming to the types of the international monetary system, the first one we talk about is the exchange rate regime. The need for converting one country's currency into those of others gives the exchange rate regime a prominent place in the international monetary system. It is indeed possible to classify the international monetary system on the basis of the degree of flexibility or rigidity of the foreign exchange rates. There is a permanently fixed and an absolutely fixed exchange rate, and these are polar extremes in between which there are various mixes of rigidity and flexibility. Sometimes nations stand ready to change the fixed par value of their currencies if so demanded by the need to correct any sort of fundamental disequilibrium in the balance of payments. And this system is known as the adjustable peg. And when the exchange rate is made flexible within wide limits but not beyond them, we have what we call the wide band regime. Under the crawling peg system, exchange rates are allowed to vary by small bits at a time. And under a managed float exchange rate regime, there are no fixed par values, but the monetary authority does intervene in the foreign exchange market so as to prevent the exchange rate from moving away from its long-term trend. Finally, we come to the recent or a new approach which we call the target zone approach. It involves the setting up of a set of mutually consistent targets for trade-weighted real exchange rates by major economies such as the United States, Japan, Germany, and so on. And since the targets are for real rates, the nominal rates are free to vary continuously to reflect the differences in the interest rates. With targets given, the participating countries do remain committed to keep the exchange rate within a band or zone of around 10% on either side of the targets. At the same time, the limits are kept soft by permitting countries to exceed the limits in certain exceptional circumstances. Next, we come to what we call the monetary standard. This is a second way of characterizing the international monetary system in terms of the nature of the reserve assets. There are two major types of international reserve assets, and they are A, the commodity reserves, and B, the fiduciary or the fiat reserves. The essential difference between these two lies in the intrinsic value of the relevant reserve asset. While the commodity reserves like gold have some intrinsic value other than, of course, the value of money, the fiduciary reserves such as the special drawing rights, and we have the national currencies which are not convertible into commodity reserves, they basically do not have any such intrinsic quality. On the basis of the nature of reserves held by the monetary authority, a threefold classification of the international monetary system is possible. Number one, we have the pure commodity standards, where all reserves consists of commodity reserves such as the gold standard. Next, we have the pure fiduciary standard, in which the entire reserve consists essentially of fiduciary reserves, example, the inconvertible paper standard. And then we have the mixed standards, in which the reserves are partly commodity reserves and partly fiduciary reserves, example, the gold exchange standard. It should be noted here that either criteria, that is the type of the exchange rate regime or the nature of reserve assets, can be used to characterize the entire international monetary system. This allows one to use different names to refer to the same international monetary system so as to put emphasis on one criteria or the other. To the concept of the international gold standard. The international gold standard flourished in a brief period of history, emerging around 1870s and collapsing with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. The pure gold standard provides the clearest example of the fixed exchange rate regime. It has certain distinguishing characteristics such as the government is going to fix the price of gold, and then it fixes the value of its money in terms of gold. Then the government is committed to ensure convertibility of the currency. In other words, the government will on demand buy and sell gold at different official rates. So if you have gold, you can get it converted into the domestic currency at the fixed rate. Or if you want gold, you can walk into the central bank, buy gold at the fixed rate, and walk away with the gold. Thirdly, the government provides a 100% gold backing, or what we called a 100% cover. In other words, it essentially means that it basically creates money when it buys gold and destroys money only by selling gold. For instance, under a 100% cover, if the public buys $100 worth of gold from the central bank, there is a 1-for-1 reduction in the stock of money outstanding. So a 1-for-1 increase in money supply takes place when the central bank buys gold for currency. So the gold standard has a built-in mechanism for correcting any imbalance in the international balance of payments. For example, for simplicity, let us assume that US trades only with Britain and Britain trades only with the US. Now, if US has a balance of payment deficit, there will be a net outflow of gold from US to Britain. The deficit is thus temporarily financed by movement of gold between the two countries. Now, since the domestic money supply is based on gold, the quantity of money will fall in US and rise in Britain. The change in money supply will affect spending. Monetary decline in US will cause the interest rates in US to rise and spending to fall. The opposite will happen in Britain. These changes will have their impact in the foreign exchange market. The US import demand schedule will continuously shift to the left and its export schedule is going to shift to the right until the deficit is totally eliminated. Thus, the process which started with financing the deficit has ultimately ended in an adjustment or elimination of it. And so, this exchange rate which is calculated from the relative price of gold is basically called gold parity. Now, during World War I, most countries departed from the gold standard. European governments needed gold to finance war. Belligerent nations suspended convertibility of their currencies into gold and imposed embargo on gold exports. Governments made it illegal for individuals to hold gold and required them to sell their gold to the government at the official gold price or at the gold parity. The classical gold standard thus came to an end in the world. Private individuals freely traded one paper currency for another at prices determined by the forces of demand and supply. As a result, in fact, a purely floating exchange rate regime took the place of the fixed exchange rate system of the gold standard, and this led to wild fluctuations in the exchange rates. After the First World War, major industrial countries tried hard to revive the pre-war gold standard. However, attempt to value gold at the pre-war parity despite rapid price inflation in the intervening years was leading to a lot of trouble. And the trouble was in the form of a shortage of gold as a reserve asset. As a device for economizing on the old, the Financial Committee of the Genoa Conference of 1922 recommended the adoption of the gold exchange standard. It required only the willingness of some countries to hold as international reserves the currencies of nations that held reserves of gold. The reserve currency countries whose currencies were held by others continued to follow the rule of the gold standard, ready to exchange gold for their own currencies. This economized on the use of gold as the ultimate reserve asset. The gold exchange standard broke down during the Great Depression as one country after another abandoned its commitment to fix the price of its currency against the US dollar. For example, in the late 1920s and the early 1930s, Britain struggled to maintain the pound at $4.80, but gave up in September 1931 because its stock of gold and the foreign exchange was running out and it was unwilling to depress its economy any further. In the decade of the Great Depression of the early 1930s, various governments were trying to outdo each other in the game of competitive depreciation. These desperate attempts were aimed at eliminating domestic unemployment and restoring the external balance of their respective countries. The foreign trade became seriously disorganized and fragmented during the period 1931 to 1935. The Tripartite Agreement of Cooperation between France, Britain, and the United States, which was signed in 1936, did raise some hope of restoring order in the international economic scenario. But the hope was dashed at the outbreak of World War II in 1939. Any serious attempt at any sort of comprehensive reform of the international monetary system was not undertaken until the end of the Second World War. Next, we come to a very important segment, and this is called the Bretton Woods system, which started in 1944 and ended in 1971. Leaders from 44 non-communist countries met in New Hampshire, USA in 1944 with the aim of evolving a plan for regulating the international financial system, and this was the first attempt at a concerted action in the international monetary history. The British delegation was led by the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, while at the head of the US delegation was H.D. Dexter, an American diplomat. Two proposals for reforms were tabled by the two delegations. Keynes's proposal centered on the creation of a clearing union with overdraft facilities and the power to create reserves. A new unit of account called banker was proposed, and a need for bearing at least a part of the adjustment burden by the surplus country was emphasized. The agreement that was finally hammered out by the conference was, however, by the Dexter Plan. The treaty was called the Bretton Woods system. The important feature of the agreement were as follows: 1. Establishment of the adjustable peg system. 2. Augmentation of international reserves and liquidity. And 3. The currency convertibility and multilateral trade. Let's come to it one by one. What do we mean by the adjustable peg system? As we have seen in the interwar period, the attempts to keep the exchange rate fixed by pegging the currency to gold failed, and the free floating that ensued brought enormous chaos and confusion. This experience prompted the delegates of the Bretton Woods to devise a system which combined the desired effect of the fixed exchange rate system and that of the floating exchange rate system. In the short run, the adjustable peg system was to operate like a gold standard. The price of gold was initially fixed at $35 an ounce, and the dollars held by the central bank and the official monetary institutions were to be freely convertible into gold. The US stood ready to buy and sell unlimited amount of gold at the official rate, making the dollar their key currency. The monetary authorities of the rest of the world could define their currencies either in terms of US dollars or in terms of gold, and to ensure fixed exchange rates among currencies, they were to buy and sell their currencies at the declared parity. Any country facing temporary disequilibrium in the balance of payment could defend its parity by borrowing from the IMF. But if the disequilibria appeared to be fundamental, it could, with the approval of the fund, change the parity. The system was thus pegged and called adjustable. Now, next, coming to currency convertibility and multilateral trade, this feature of the Bretton Woods system is related to the requirement of the adjustable peg. The countries agreed to ensure free convertibility of their currencies at the declared rates in order to facilitate multilateral trade and payments. There were to be no restrictions on current international transactions, no discriminatory currency adjustments or arrangements, or exchange controls. Finally, what we see is the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system lacked an effective adjustment mechanism that was commensurate with its objective of multilateral trade and currency convertibility. Frequently, there was a frequent change in the exchange rates, and that made it really difficult. A member country facing a balance of payment deficit was encouraged to finance it by using its own reserves or by using its automatic borrowing rights with the IMF. Even for persistent deficits, the fund policy seemed to favor expenditure-reducing policies, that is the monetary and the fiscal policies. Only in case of genuine problem or genuine cases, genuine fundamental imbalances, exchange rate adjustment through devaluation was approved. And generally, the need for devaluation was taken as a sign of failure to manage the economy well. As a result, the real needs for exchange rate adjustment were not timely recognized, and the country concerned had to take the unpopular step of deflating their currency. The system of pegging, combined with the need for prior approval of the IMF for devaluation, made the weak currencies easy victims of the speculators, and of course that led to more and more of destabilization. The speculator could easily detect whether a country had been running persistent and unsustainable deficit. Seeking IMF approval for devaluation would further strengthen their perception about that particular currency and about chances of possible devaluation, and they would then sell the devalued suspect currency in the hope of buying it cheaper after a possible devaluation. If their expectation proved true, they made handsome profits. But if the parity somewhat successfully defended, they stood to lose very little. Speculation was then becoming just a one-way gamble, a one-sided gamble. The most sinister aspect of this situation was that the speculators could precipitate a devaluation by their own actions, which would otherwise be avoided. Their expectations rather would be called self-fulfilling in nature, and this would not be true if the exchange rates were flexible, because the actual exchange rates could be higher or lower than what the speculator expected them to be. There was another problem in the liquidity creation mechanism of the Bretton Woods system, which finally hastened its downfall. In the post-war period, Europe and Japan experienced rapid growth and gained competitive strength relative to the US firms. As a result, the US balance of payment position moved into large deficits. The US deficits, in fact, represented a growing demand for the international economy for dollar reserves to meet the monetary needs of international transactions. The so-called redundancy problem arose because the US could not devalue its dollar in terms of gold. The only way this could come about was by revaluation of currencies of the surplus countries, that was Germany and Japan. By building up deficits continuously, the US tried to ensure consistency amongst the national policies, because all countries could not run surplus at the same time. But this build-up could not continue indefinitely without raising doubts about the US's ability to convert dollars into gold at the fixed parity. These problems surfaced and intensified in the 1960s. People began to lose confidence in the dollar. Herein lay the dilemma. For supplying the needed liquidity, US deficit needed to grow. But if it grew, the confidence in the convertibility of the dollar could not be sustained. To put it in another way, as the quantity of reserves grew, the quality deteriorated. Finally, the problem became so acute that President Nixon of the United States broke the link between dollar and gold in August 1971, thus bringing the Bretton Woods Agreement to an end. So now what we have managed flexibility. Major industrial nations slowly drifted towards a managed floating regime with several variations. The present system may be described as a managed flexibility system, a managed floating system where most industrial and financial nations such as the US, Japan, UK intervene in the foreign exchange market to reduce the day-to-day volatility of the exchange rate. Otherwise, the rates are allowed to fluctuate freely along their long-term trend. But there have been exceptions. In many instances, it has been seen that the central banks have tried to oppose the basic trends in the exchange rates. Deficit nations have bought their own currencies to prevent them from depreciating, while the surplus nations have sold their currencies to prevent them from appreciating. This mongrel system is widely known as the dirty float or the managed float system. This is exactly what is happening at present in the Indian economy. The Indian government is using its huge amount of foreign exchange reserves it has to keep the dollar at bay with that of the to keep the rupee at bay with that of the dollar. Now, here we also have the concepts of the target zones and the crawling peg. Some countries, in the context of target zone, some countries follow the policy of flexible rates with target zones. Their currencies are pegged against one another and then allowed to float against other currencies, say the dollar. Such an attempt by the European Community countries have been called snake within the tunnel. The reason is that the movement of jointly floating currencies is compared with a snake is restricted by intervention within a narrow band which is called the tunnel. This arrangement, however, did not last long. And next we come to the concept of the crawling peg. Many small countries peg their currencies to one major currency such as the dollar or a basket of currencies. They follow a system of intervention which is called the crawling peg, in which the per value is adjusted upward or downward in small doses or bit. One reason for this preference for slowly adjustment the pegged rate is that in the absence of established forward exchange rate markets, they can insure against exchange risk in trade only by tying their exchange rates to a major currency. Another motive is to guard against destabilizing speculation of the absolutely flexible exchange rates. We also need international cooperation. The two major problems that have been afflicting the present international system of managed flexibility are excessive volatility of the exchange rates and the persistent large disequilibrium in the foreign exchange market. The interdependence of the national economies through trade and capital flows was unavoidable even when the exchange rates were allowed to find their own levels freely in the foreign open market economies, because domestic actions could not be insulated from spilling over national or regional boundaries. So for that we had the famous Plaza Accord, which was signed in 1985, and the Louvre Accord, which was signed in 1987. Despite these attempts at macroeconomic policy coordinations, it is doubtful how far nations can progress towards the goal of effective and substantial cooperation and coordination. The reason for the doubt is that nations are often unwilling to surrender their policy autonomy as long as they have different inflation-unemployment trade-offs. But the search for major institutional innovation to ensure coordination of economic policies will go on eternally. So to conclude, we can say the international monetary system has evolved continuously over the last century, reflecting ongoing changes in global economic realities and in economic thoughts. Throughout this whole period, there has been a continuous search for an effective nominal anchor. In the process, the binding rules that marked its passage through the gold standard and the Bretton Woods regime have fallen by the wayside. The gold standard proved or we can say the gold standard provided the anchor in the pre-World War period, a period which was characterized by free capital flows and also a fixed exchange rate system, and hence there was no independent monetary policy. The interwar period was marked by confusion, which led to the Bretton Woods system of semi-fixed exchange rates and controlled capital flows that provided scope for independent monetary policy. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the early 70s led to the introduction of the prevailing system of floating exchange rate, free capital flows, and independent monetary policy in major advanced capitalist countries of the world. Within this post-Bretton Woods framework, the monetary policy framework also transitioned from monetary targeting regime in the 70s and 90s to inflation targeting frameworks. Given the preference for small, open capital accounts and the belief in efficient markets, financial sector regulation moved from an intrusive framework to a light touch framework. Thank you.